What are you willing to give up for the ones you love? Explore the heartbreaking and beautiful stories of ultimate sacrifice and the enduring power of selfless devotion in a selfish world. Hit subscribe today to experience these deeply moving and cinematic narratives.
I didn't scream. I didn't slam doors. I didn't even cry. I just sat on the edge of my bed, the narrow guest bed in the room my son had converted from a storage closet, and I listened to the sound of my own breathing in the dark. Slow, steady, deliberate, like a woman who had already decided something, even if she didn't know it yet. And please, stay with me until the end. Because what happened 3 months later, what I quietly set in motion that very night, changed everything. For all of us, my name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse, raised my son Michael alone after his father walked out when Michael was 9, and I put every dollar I had, every single one, into making sure that boy had a future. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you this so you understand exactly what was at stake when my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said what she said. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. I was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease 14 months before any of this happened. My neurologist, a quiet man with kind eyes, told me on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He said we had options. He said the progression was slow. He said many people lived full, independent lives for years, even decades after a diagnosis like mine. I drove home alone that day. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to navigate the exit ramp. Then I went home, made a cup of chamomile tea, and called my son. Michael answered on the second ring. He was warm. He was concerned. He said all the right things. He asked if I needed him to come over. I said no. I was fine. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, he had suggested gently, lovingly, I thought that it might be time to think about a different living situation. Just so you're not alone, Mom, he said. Just so we can keep an eye on things. I had been living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati for 6 years. It was mine, comfortable, full of the things I loved, my books, my plants, the quilt my mother had made before she passed. I was not struggling. I was not falling. I was managing a diagnosis with the same discipline I had applied to everything else in my life. But Michael kept calling, and Claire, his wife, a woman I had always tried to love, even when she made it difficult. Claire got on the phone one evening and said, very carefully, that they had plenty of space, that their home in Columbus had a finished room on the main floor, that it would be better for everyone if I was close. I want to be honest with you. Part of me was relieved. I was 66 years old and newly diagnosed with a progressive neurological condition. And the idea of being alone, truly alone, in a way I hadn't let myself fully feel yet, was something I had not yet found the courage to examine. So, I said yes. I gave up my apartment. I sold or donated most of my furniture. I packed what I could fit into 3 suitcases and a box of books, and I moved into my son's house on a cold Saturday in February. The room was fine. It was on the main floor, as promised, a converted home office with a window that faced the side fence and a closet just big enough for my clothes. There was a small dresser and a twin bed and a lamp on the nightstand that flickered if you turned it on too fast. I put my mother's quilt on the bed. I set my books on the windowsill. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was love. I want to tell you that the first few months were warm, that we ate dinner together and Claire asked about my day and Michael sat with me on Sunday mornings the way he used to when he was small. I want to tell you that. But the truth is, something shifted almost immediately. Not dramatically. Not all at once. It was the kind of shift that happens slowly. The way a house settles on its foundation, small cracks, almost invisible, until one day you notice the door doesn't close the way it used to. Claire was polite, always polite, but there was a texture to her politeness that I recognized from 30 years of nursing, the careful distance of someone who is performing a feeling they don't actually have. She never asked about my appointments. She rearranged the kitchen and didn't tell me where anything had moved. When her friends came over, she would mention me briefly. Michael's mother is staying with us for a while, with an emphasis on for a while that landed like a small, precise cut. Michael noticed nothing. Or if he did, he said nothing. He was busy. He was always busy long hours at the engineering firm. Weekend calls, business trips to Atlanta and Denver that kept him away for days at a time. When he was home, he was tired. When I tried to talk to him, really talk to him, he would listen with one eye on his phone and squeeze my shoulder on his way out of the room. I kept my space clean. I cooked when I could. I offered to watch their children, my grandchildren, Lily, who was 7, and Owen, who was 4, whenever Claire needed a break. She accepted, sometimes, but she also, increasingly, found reasons to be home when I was with the kids. Hovering, redirecting, as though she didn't entirely trust me alone with them. I told myself it was just her personality. I told myself she was tired, stressed, stretched thin between her job and the children. I told myself that living with a mother-in-law is genuinely difficult and I should extend more grace. I extended grace. I kept extending it, until the night I couldn't sleep. It was a Wednesday, 8 months after I had moved in. The house was quiet. I had gotten up at 2 a.m. to get a glass of water. My medication sometimes made me thirsty at odd hours. And I was walking back down the hallway toward my room when I heard voices from the kitchen. I wasn't eavesdropping. I want to be clear about that. I had simply stopped walking because something in Claire's tone, sharp, low, controlled, made my feet stop before my mind decided to. I can't keep doing this, Michael. Her voice was tight. I'm serious. I have been patient. I have been so patient. But I did not sign up to run a care facility out of my own home. I heard Michael say something I couldn't make out. Low. Placating. No, she said. No, don't do that. Don't make me the villain here. She's your mother. And I understand that. But she is sick, Michael. She is going to get worse. And I am not. I refuse to watch my children grow up watching their grandmother deteriorate in the next room. I don't want that for them. I don't want that for us. Silence. Then her voice again, quieter but somehow harder. I want her out of this house. I want her out before the end of the year. You need to figure out a placement, a facility, something, because I am not doing this anymore. I don't remember walking back to my room. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed. I remember the specific quality of the silence, how complete it was. I remember thinking very clearly that I was not surprised. And I remember thinking, in the same clear, quiet voice, that this changed everything. I did not cry. I opened my laptop. I need you to understand something about me. I am not a wealthy woman in the way that word is typically used. I did not come from money. I did not marry money. What I have, I built slowly, carefully, over decades through work and discipline, and a stubborn refusal to spend more than I earned. When Michael was 32 and newly married and wanting to buy a house in a neighborhood that was just slightly beyond what he and Claire could afford on their own, I gave him money. Not a loan. A gift. $130,000, the majority of my savings at the time, because he was my son, and I wanted him to have a good life, and because Claire had smiled at me that day in a way that made me feel, briefly, like maybe things would be different than I feared. But I also, and this is the part that matters, kept something for myself. A smaller account, a careful, quiet account that I had never mentioned to Michael or Claire, fed by decades of modest but consistent saving, the sale of my parents' house after my mother passed, and a small inheritance from an aunt I had stayed close to when the rest of the family had not. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to matter. The morning after I heard Claire's voice in the kitchen, I called my attorney. Her name is Diane, and I have known her for 20 years. I told her I needed to review my estate documents. I told her I might need to make some changes. How soon? She asked. As soon as you can see me, I said. I also began looking at apartments, not care facilities, not assisted living. Apartments. I spent 3 weeks, quietly, in the evenings, searching listings in Cincinnati and in Dayton, and in a small lakeside town in northern Ohio where I had always imagined myself growing old. I made calls. I toured 2 units via video. I put a deposit down on a 1-bedroom apartment with a second-floor view of a courtyard, in a building where the neighbors were quiet and the maintenance was fast, and no one would need me to explain myself. I told no one. During those 3 weeks, Life in the house continued as it always had. Michael came home tired. Claire was polite. I helped Lily with her reading and taught Owen how to make scrambled eggs and said nothing. Nothing at all about what I had heard or what I was doing. I smiled at breakfast. I folded my laundry. I watered the plants in the kitchen that Claire always forgot. And I waited. The conversation Michael finally had with me happened on a Sunday afternoon, 3.5 weeks after that night. He sat across from me at the kitchen table Claire had taken the kids to her mother's, conspicuously, and he folded his hands the way he always does when he is uncomfortable, and he said, "Mom, Claire and I have been talking. We think it might be time to look at some other options for your living situation." I looked at my son. I looked at his hands, folded on the table. I thought about the 9-year-old boy who had cried for 3 days when his father left, and who I had held every night until he stopped crying, even on the nights when I cried too after he fell asleep. I said, "What kind of options?" He said there were some very good facilities. He had already done some research. There was one in Dublin that was highly rated, another closer to us in Westerville. They had memory care units, he said, which would be useful as my condition progressed. I let him finish. Then I said, "I appreciate you telling me, Michael. I've actually been looking into some options myself." He blinked. "You have?" "I found an apartment," I said, "in Marblehead, up near the lake. It's lovely. I move in on the 15th. The 15th was 11 days away. He stared at me. I watched something move across his face. Relief, I think. And then guilt about the relief. And then something more complicated that I didn't try to name. "Mom," he said. "You don't have to. I mean, we can help you look. We can find something closer." "It's already done," I said. "The deposit is paid. I'm looking forward to it." I stood up. I put my cup in the sink. I said, "I think I'll start packing today, if you don't mind." I moved out on a Tuesday morning. Michael helped me carry the boxes. He was quiet the entire time. Claire stood in the doorway and said, with great warmth, that she hoped I would be happy there and that they would come visit soon. She hugged me. I hugged her back. "I want to tell you about the apartment. I want you to see it the way I saw it that first evening, the way the late afternoon light came through the west-facing window and turned the whole room amber. The courtyard below was bare but orderly. Someone had planted bulbs along the edges of the path. I set my mother's quilt on the bed and my books on the shelves, and I stood in my own kitchen, and I made tea, and I did not perform anything for anyone. I slept 9 hours that night. I hadn't slept 9 hours in 8 months. My health, I should tell you, was stable. My neurologist was pleased with my progress. The tremor in my left hand, which had worried me when I first noticed it, had not progressed significantly. I was walking every morning. I had joined a small book club at the community center 2 blocks away, and I had begun, very quietly, to feel like myself again. And then, about 6 weeks after I moved out, Michael called. He called on a Thursday evening. He sounded different, tighter, thinner, like a wire pulled past its comfortable tension. He asked how I was. I said I was well. He said that was good. That was really good. Then he asked very carefully, very casually, whether I had ever thought about revising the arrangement around the money I had given him for the house. I was quiet for a moment. "What kind of revision?" I asked. He explained, in the careful language of someone who has rehearsed the conversation, that he and Claire had been looking at some financial options, and that it would help them significantly if the contribution I had made could be formalized differently, as a loan perhaps with a repayment structure, or alternatively, and this was the part where his voice changed, became slightly too smooth if I had considered updating my estate documents to reflect the current situation more clearly. "The current situation," I repeated. "Just, with your health and everything." I understood exactly what he was saying. He was saying, "We want to know what's coming to us, and we want it secured before your health declines any further." I said, "I'll talk to my attorney." Then I called Diane. "What I'm about to tell you is not revenge. I want to be clear about that. I did not do what I did out of anger or spite. I did it because I had spent 67 years building something, not just money, but a sense of my own value, my own dignity, and I had no intention of letting it be managed or minimized or quietly absorbed into someone else's plans for my remaining years. 3 weeks after Michael's call, I finalized changes to my estate documents, the apartment in Marblehead, the contents of my private account, a small portfolio of investments I had built quietly over the years. None of it would go to Michael. It would go, instead, into a trust for Lily and Owen to be administered by Diane until they each turned 25. There was also a provision for my niece, my brother's daughter, who had called me every week for the past 4 years without ever asking for anything. Michael and Claire would receive nothing, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I had learned with great clarity that the love they had offered me had terms, and I had decided that I was done operating within someone else's terms. I did not tell them. I simply let it be. What I did not expect, what I genuinely did not anticipate, was how quickly things would begin to unravel on their own. I learned about it first from Lily. She called me on a Saturday morning in April, using Michael's phone. She was 7, and she had figured out how to navigate the contacts, which made me prouder than I could say, and she asked if I was coming to her spring concert. I said of course I was. She said good, because Daddy had been sad, and she thought seeing me would help. I asked her, gently, what she meant by sad. She said that Mommy and Daddy had been arguing a lot, that there had been nights when one of them slept on the couch, that Owen had had a nightmare, and when she went to get her parents, only her father was in the bedroom. I went to the spring concert. Lily sang beautifully. Afterward, in the parking lot, Michael walked me to my car and stood there in the cold for a moment, his hands in his pockets looking at the ground. "Things are hard," he said finally. I didn't ask for details. I didn't push. I just stood with him in the cold and let him say whatever he needed to say. He said that he and Claire had been struggling for a while, that some financial pressures had created tension, that he thought she had been unhappy for longer than he realized, and that he was only now understanding how much he hadn't noticed. I thought of myself, 8 months ago, in a narrow bed in a converted storage room, extending grace. I put my hand on my son's arm. I said, "I'm here, Michael." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw, in his face, something I recognized. The specific grief of a person who has only just understood what they allowed to happen. It is not a comfortable thing to witness in your child, but it is necessary. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. His voice broke, slightly, on the last word. I said, "I know." We stood there a little longer. Then I hugged him, and I got in my car, and I drove home along the lake road with the window down even though it was cold, because the air coming off the water smelled like spring, and I wanted to feel it. I want to tell you where things stand now, because I think you deserve to know. Michael and Claire are separated. She moved to her mother's house in March, and from what Michael has told me, she has no intention of coming back. The reasons are more complicated than one evening's conversation in a kitchen. I understand that. Marriages don't end because of one thing. They end because of the accumulation of all the things that went unaddressed. I am not naive enough to think I was the only issue, or even the main one. Michael is renting an apartment now, not far from the house, so that Lily and Owen can move between them easily. He calls me twice a week. Last month, he drove up to Marblehead on a Sunday with both kids, and we spent the afternoon walking along the water and making soup in my kitchen. Owen spilled half his bowl, and we laughed about it for 20 minutes. My health remains stable. I walk every morning. I have a good neurologist and a good attorney and a window that faces a courtyard where the bulbs have now come up small, yellow, stubborn, pushing through the cold ground without asking anyone's permission. Claire called me once, about 6 weeks ago. She was composed, careful, everything I had come to expect from her. She said she wanted me to know that she had never intended for things to go the way they did. She said she hoped we could have a civil relationship for the sake of the children. I said, "Of course." I meant it. Civility is not warmth, but it is something, and it cost me nothing to offer it. What she asked next was more difficult. She asked delicately, with great care, whether I had given any thought to the estate arrangements. Whether, given everything, I might reconsider. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "The arrangements are for Lily and Owen. They've always been for Lily and Owen. That hasn't changed." She was quiet. I said, "Was there anything else?" "There wasn't. I have thought many times about the woman I was 14 months ago standing in a parking garage, sitting alone in her car for 20 minutes, trying to find the courage to drive home after a diagnosis that changed the shape of her future. I have thought about what that woman was afraid of. She was afraid of being a burden. She was afraid of being invisible. She was afraid that the people she loved most would look at her illness and see only inconvenience. She was not wrong to be afraid. Some of what she feared came true. But here is what she didn't know, sitting in that parking garage. She was not finished. She was not a problem to be managed or a liability to be quietly relocated. She was a woman with resources and history, and a mind that was still, entirely, her own. And when the moment came when she was given her answer in a kitchen at 2 a.m, she did not collapse. She made a plan. I think about Lily and Owen, who will inherit what I've built when the time comes. I hope they are old enough by then that they understand what it means. I hope they know that the best thing I ever gave them wasn't money. It was the example of a woman who knew her own worth and refused, even at 67, even with a tremor in her left hand, to let anyone convince her otherwise. I'm sitting by my window as I write this. The courtyard is quiet. There's a cup of tea on the table, still warm. The quilt from my mother is folded at the foot of my bed, and the light this afternoon is the same amber it was the very first evening I moved in, when I stood in my own kitchen and made tea and did not perform anything for anyone. I am not angry. I am not bitter. I am just here present, steady, mine. And that, after everything, is the sweetest thing of all.